and I was still 20 at the time, and I couldn't handle this. So I was taken to Nyami's place, and when I got there, Nyami was crying terribly.
And then there were those with great loss in their hearts and anger in their veins.
I don't want to cry. Really, I don't want to cry, but I'd like the commission to help me.
They were the brave pioneers of the Truth Commission, those who led all the others to sew their truths into the patchwork quilt of a new history.
There's been a lot of evil. And there's been a lot of evil in this country. And it's being
We lost the sound, Jed.
I heard their voices.
Is that better?
No one screamed twice.
Yep.
Each one screamed just once. Then I'd hear the next one. And another one. Until they finished them all.
There were those who wept about loved ones who disappeared without a trace. But the common thread was that everywhere, the extent of the horror was more than anyone had ever suspected. Even the smallest village had its casualties. The process was not easy. Often the truth was frightening. As the process gained momentum, victims sometimes came face to face with perpetrators and the grim reality of what they did. Few remained untouched as the floodgates of emotion were wedged open.
It is 25 years now, and that I will not forget what happened. I ask the Almighty that I will not forget what happened and that I need to know.
I remember pain of a scale that I didn't think a human being could ever experience.
So I would just crawl into the toilet and drink from the toilet sink.
There were the cynics, of course. Some called it the Crying Commission, but often they were white or old allies of apartheid and scared of the guilt that came with hearing the truth. But then there were those who became part of the telling, and through that, some sort of reconciliation.
U het in die harte van verwonde, soms verklemde mense ingekom. My kindersverhaal is klein in vergelijking met soveel ander vir wie ons harte bloed. Ons swaar kry is maar 'n druppel in die Suid-Afrikaanse emmer.
But what did all these who came to bear their souls seek? For many it was simply enough to tell their story to a nation whose time it was to listen. Others wanted to lay the past to rest. Again and again they asked for the remains of those who had disappeared. For some, like the family of murdered ANC cadre Pilan Dwandwe, this became a terrible reality. For others, the bones were lost forever, dumped into this river. But knowing this was the beginning of the ending for them. Over the 14 months, the South African truth process developed its own unique identity. Even while listening to the most harrowing testimony, people could still laugh. People also sang, gave comfort to others, and when there was nothing more to say, they prayed.
The Amnesty Committee consisted of legal people, and each sitting was presided over by a judge. Unlike the hearings on human rights violations, all participants had the right to be represented by lawyers who could test evidence through the cross-examination of witnesses. The Act stipulated 3 preconditions for amnesty. Applicants had to speak the truth and reveal all relevant information. They had to prove that their crime was politically motivated or ordered by a political organization, and it had to be proportional to the crime.
I had gone there to shoot any living thing. It was my aim to shoot anybody within the tavern.
He just grabbed an iron pipe and beat the poor old man several times in his head. And as he did so, all the people joined in.
Kaptein van Sail het vir meneer Haasje met 'n .22 geweer geskiet. Hy het die geweer aan my oorhandig, waar ek op my beurt vir meneer Godlosi geskiet het. En meneer Lots het vir meneer Galela geskiet. En ons het al 3 die oorledenes op die houtstapel geplaas.
After 1,888 days of hearings, 1,167 applicants were granted amnesty out of 7,116 applications. The amnesty process was opposed by some political lobbies and families of survivors who insisted that it undermined justice.
I would want to stress still the fact that it was justice, not retributive justice, but restorative justice. We were looking more to heal than to punish the perpetrator. We were looking for a way of dealing with the offenses and the violations in such a way that we were not more disruptive, that we were actually using the principles of Ubuntu, which speaks about how our humanity is one that is caught up in one another's. You know, for instance, that it was through the amnesty process that we were able to, you spoke about truth, we got the truth about people who had been abducted, killed, and buried secretly. We would not have easily come by that truth. It enabled us to exhume the remains of many people who had disappeared mysteriously, and that enabled their loved ones to experience the so-called closure.
A central principle guiding the Truth Commission was that all sides of the conflict would be treated fairly and all violations of human rights be treated the same way, even if committed by former freedom fighters. The legitimacy of the armed struggle against apartheid was accepted by the Truth Commission, but the point was also made that unjust things could happen in a just war.
In war, soldiers may kill. Soldiers may kill enemy soldiers. They may intentionally, deliberately kill in combat enemy soldiers without that being murder. Combatants may legitimately kill other combatants, but the fundamental principle of justice in war is the distinction between combatants and non-combatants. You may never, even in a just war, deliberately target a civilian, a non-combatant, a bystander.
We were highly principled, and the evocation of the just war does not accept, because it would undermine the justness of the cause, that the ends justify the means.
A major criticism of the Truth Commission was that the politicians who created the climate for human rights abuses got away, and that the ordinary foot soldiers were hauled before the Truth Commission. As happened with other Truth Commissions, this was almost inevitable, because it was hard to prove that the political leadership was directly responsible.
My hands are clean, and it's nonsense to say that I knew about it. It is a lie, and it is untrue that I ever had a strategy to, through violence, destabilize.
The African National Congress realized that after the few incidents where civilians were caught, the president called us in and asked us to put a stop to this method of operation.
But why should young South Africans have to learn about the Truth Commission so long after it had ended?
Those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it. If you don't know about your country, you don't know your history, then you don't know very much that is important in your lives. You have to know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because it made a very important contribution to how we are able to live together reasonably harmoniously. Unfortunately, bygones don't in fact become bygones. We don't have the power, as it were, to nullify them, to say bygones be gone, and they go. They don't go. They return almost always to haunt us.
Years after the Truth Commission process, South Africans still ask whether the Truth Commission had really fulfilled its task of bringing about reconciliation.
No, reconciliation is a process. It's not just an event. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission made a contribution to that process. Each of us South Africans must make their own contribution.
So, again, we were watching, for those of you that have just joined, we were watching a video on a little bit of the history of the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. What I'd like to do is, I'd like to just stop before we look at the next video and see what was coming up. For those of you that are on Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, you're welcome to add your comment there. But again, what we're looking for is ways in which we think, if Louisville were to create some kind of process, what would we want to pull from? What do we think are important elements to that process in our own seeking truth and reconciliation? So those of you that are on Zoom, anything stick out with you there that felt especially important and powerful? You're welcome to unmute yourself and join in the conversation. just kind of looking for responses. Hey, Britt.
Hi, Jed. I wanted to say I really appreciate your showing that. I lived in South Africa for 2 years. It was the first time I left the United States, and I was really amazed by the spirit of forgiveness and open-heartedness that existed in the people there, especially towards me. I was there maybe just 5 years after apartheid had been disbanded, and those let's see, it was about 4 years after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when I was there. And there was still a lot of racism present. You know, white people would say things to us that really shocked me. But I would say that it was really the best start for the new South Africa, and it really was, it set a tone. Well, they really came very close to having a civil war there, even within rivaling opposition factions. And having that kind of truth telling, and as difficult as it was, you know, and as difficult as it is to watch, those people were able to tell their stories one time, and then it was out of them, you know, and release it. And I was reflecting as I was watching on that, because yesterday I attended a training, a diversity training at Ivy Tech, where I'm an adjunct instructor. And it was, and we listened to the stories of a lot of our colleagues, and it took a lot of bravery and courage for them to tell us about things that they had experienced here in Louisville. And it was shocking for me to hear some of those things. But I think the most painful thing is they have to keep repeating these stories over and over and over in these small gatherings. And one of our colleagues who is a social worker spoke about the trauma, the generations of trauma in her family. And I recognized that those symptoms of trauma, I recognized many of them in things that I've observed in my students. And I think, I don't know if South Africa's model would help us or would work, you know, well in our environment, but definitely having an event where we really all recognize the truth for once and for all. And our colleagues who have suffered these traumas don't have to keep repeating them over and over and over, trying to convince people that they really did happen. So that's just my my small observation, but I'm still learning a lot about it because I'm relatively new to Louisville. But I'm encouraged because there seems to be a really a large cohort of people who are really open to trying new things and really healing the problems of it that have existed here for generations.
Thank you, Britt, so much for that. And yeah, a lot of the models that I've been looking at, they all have some way of the storytelling. In fact, a lot of places create a bank or a way in which people can voluntarily go on and record their stories. And those get just placed up in a public space where, where everybody could have access to them. So it's just like an open forum where people could video themselves or audio record themselves, and they're just up in a public space so that, right, they don't have to continue to tell that story. So a lot of that, what are the platforms for telling and hearing stories? I think that would have to be a part of any process that we put together, so.
Absolutely, and it absolutely needs to be a safe space for those who are telling their story. It's so hard. I remember, you know, when we were in that Zoom meeting, the moderator was very careful to leave everyone's mics muted just in case there was somebody who wanted to cause even more harm in that space. And by the end of it, he, you know, surveyed the list of all the participants and said, okay, I know each one of you individually, and I think we can trust you, so we're going to open the mics now. But I like that idea that you shared of having victims be able to record the things that they've been through and tell the truth, and even perpetrators tell the truth in a place that is very safe for them, and then have a permanent record of it. Yeah. And I think the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama has been doing that for the victims of lynching and their families. And I think it's been very powerful. They just opened a museum with monuments and with records. And in reading some of the stories, I was really shocked because there are things that I never learned in my history classes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I went down last summer or last fall to the memorial with the lynching, and it was quite powerful. Yeah, I think there's those public recognitions are so important, and that story just continues to be told. And so thanks. How about other folks want to make any comments that we're watching, just kind of what showed up for you as important? I think that feels important, is to hear what others think and experienced. Anybody else want to join in? Anybody on Facebook want to add a comment? If you were watching, you're welcome to do that. So if not, I'm going to go ahead and go to the next video. And again, this is a truth and reconciliation process that move to the next one. This one came out of Greensboro, North Carolina. So it took some similar principles to a different experience. And so I wanted to show this one as an example of another type of process, but that was used here in the United States, to see if it has some ideas or things that we might learn from as well.
May God provide this commission with the will, the insight, the vision, the sensitivity and caring to be that catalyst for truth, healing, and restorative justice in this community. What a blessed day.
On June 12, 2004, over 500 people gathered in Greensboro, North Carolina to witness the swearing in of the first Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the United States.
It is with great confidence in the people of Greensboro and in this citizen-led process that I charge you as Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners to carry out your work with honor, for much of the quality of the work you do will shape the quality of life in our city and beyond for years to come. God bless you.
I really did not fully appreciate the magnitude of the endeavor until I was standing in the room with all the people who came for the swearing in. And as I heard different representatives from the community in Greensboro talked about their hopes and their desires for us and for the truth and for reconciliation.
The installation of this commission was the culmination of nearly 5 years of work and planning by a group called the Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project. Initiated by survivors of a violent episode in Greensboro's past, guided by a national advisory board and the International Center for Transitional Justice, and propelled by the participation of a cross-section of Greensboro citizens called the Local Task Force. The project had crafted a selection process and a mandate for a commission independent of any external influence to examine the context, causes, sequence, and consequence of the events of November 3rd, 1979, and to issue a report to the Greensboro community.
When I first heard about the commission, I was excited about its potential for helping our community identify and heal some of the divisions that exist. And I realize a lot of folks in different parts of our community are not aware of those divisions or choose to believe they don't exist. But in my work dealing with racism and diversity and cultural conflict, I see every day evidence of those divisions.
On November 3rd, 1979, on a bright Saturday morning, a group of labor organizers assembled in Morningside Homes, a predominantly Black housing project in Greensboro, for an educational conference and an anti-Klan march with the prominent slogan, "Death to the Klan." A caravan of 9 cars carrying Klan and American Nazi Party members drove to Greensboro to disrupt the march. As the caravan reached the housing project, words were exchanged and a confrontation ensued. The Klan and Nazis took guns from their cars and opened fire on the crowd. Five people were killed. 10 others were wounded. Police did not arrive on the scene until several minutes after the shooting stopped, but news crews and photographers captured the event on film and videotape, and the images from Greensboro were soon broadcast around the world. In the state and federal trials that followed, 2 all-white juries found the Klan and Nazi members not guilty of any crimes. In 1985, a civil suit filed by the relatives of those killed on November 3rd was resolved with the finding that the Greensboro Police Department and members of the Klan and Nazi organizations were jointly liable for the wrongful death of one of the march participants. With a painful collective memory of tragic violence, Greensboro would sometimes prefer to leave the events of November 3rd, 1979, out of the telling of the city's proud history. The Greensboro Project is drawing inspiration and guidance from a number of truth and reconciliation processes around the world, the best known of which is South Africa.
You are going to be a crippled community, whether you like it or not. You are going to be a crippled community as long as you refuse to face up to your past.
A press conference and open house on January 25, 2005, marked the beginning of the public phase of the Commission's work. The Commission and its staff set up an office in downtown Greensboro, took statements from individuals, facilitated conversations with relevant stakeholders, held and participated in community events, conducted a door-to-door campaign, met with representatives from other truth commissions, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and launched a website, TV show, blog, and weekly newsletter. Even as the Commission set about its tasks, the need for its existence and integrity of its independence was the subject of ongoing debate in the media, the community, and at City Hall.
Motion to oppose the Truth and Reconciliation program.
Okay. To not endorse, I guess. To oppose. To oppose. And that passed 6-3.
We will now bring this hearing to order. We thank everyone here for their willingness and openness to listen to the variety of viewpoints on traumatic events in our history.
Over the course of 3 public hearings held in Greensboro, 54 people spoke to the Commission about the events of November 3rd, their origins, and lasting impact.
The reason I came to Greensboro, they put the poster out. Death to the Klan. Said we was hiding under rocks, we were scum. I'm not scum, I'm as good as any man walks on this earth.
Gunfire, screams, gunfire, screams. Engines gunning as the shooters fled. An eerie silence. I could smell gunpowder in the air and heard the groaning of people who were dying.
You don't let 2 groups with extreme political views from each other come together without a buffer. And the buffer would have been the police. In my opinion, yes, we should have been there.
As soon as the shooting stopped and I realized that people were injured, I searched for Caesar and I found him dead. And I immediately knew that we had been set up.
after November the 3rd, the police treated us like we had committed the crimes, like we had killed the communist workers on November the 3rd. We were put on curfew. There were helicopters. There was tons of police. We were in a war zone. We were treated like prisoners in our own community.
My 2 children saw their Auntie Sandy with a bullet between her eyes and blood streaming down her face. This scene was permanently burned into the consciousness of my little girls. And when I hear establishment apologists with glib arrogance promote the absolutely false view that I planned a shootout and then trick the police, my blood boils as my soul rages.
You know, there are many people whose lives changed that day, changed to not trust in the system that's supposed to protect you. It's changed to, you know, a fear of many things, but my life never changed. It started that way.
After 26 years, there are people who were still afraid of retaliation or speaking at the public hearings. How intimidating, how shocking when you get right down to it. I was extremely proud of the people who did consent to speak and presenting such different views, which is what we needed, you know, and without that, we wouldn't have had the balance that we're able to come up with.
Nearly 2 years after taking their oaths, the 7 members of the Greensboro Truth and Reconciliation Commission present their final report with findings and recommendations for the city.
On the morning of November 3rd, 1979, Klan and Nazi members headed for the parade starting point, intending to break the law, and came with an arsenal of weapons and heavy firearms. The heaviest burden of responsibility is on Klansmen and Nazis, who after an initial stick fight with demonstrators, returned to their cars, retrieved weapons, and fired at mostly unarmed demonstrators when the caravan's path of exit was cleared and they could have fled. We find that the Communist Workers' Party members did not seek or deserve to be killed. They did, however, underestimate the danger of taunting the Klan with provocative language and for beating on caravan cars with sticks. The primary contributor to the loss of life was the absence of police, which endangered the welfare of all involved, including residents of Morningside homes where the shootings took place. Nearly all commissioners believe that the police absence was the result of some intentionality on the part of at least some officers in the Greensboro Police Department. Paid police informant and Greensboro Klansman Eddie Dawson played a leadership role in bringing the Klan and Nazis into contact with the Communist Workers' Party. Despite knowledge of Dawson's actions and other intelligence that violence was likely, police made decisions to give Dawson a copy of the parade permit, not to warn demonstrators about the supremacist plans, not to be anywhere near the scene, not to accompany the caravan in a noticeable way, not to monitor the situation using hand radios, and not to stop fleeing cars after the tragedy. City officials endeavored to protect the city's image by attempting to distance Greensboro from the underlying issues that contributed to the event. The city's elected officials and managers responded to the tragedy by clamping down on citizen protests in the interest of security through tactics such as curfews, National Guard presence, public service announcements, obstruction surveillance, and intimidation of subsequent protests. The verdicts in the 3 trials conflicted with what seems to be a common sense assessment of wrongdoing based on the videotape, resulting in a greater distrust of the justice system. A flawed system of jury selection created all-white juries unrepresentative of the community, contributing to the acquittals. We found that the events of November 3rd, 1979 are woven through with issues of race and class. Our report discusses underlying issues, including racial and economic justice, white supremacy, and the failure of the police and justice system to provide equal protection to all residents.
We've worked together for 2 years and, did the public hearings, and now we have a report which is several hundreds of pages, but I still see it only as a part of the work, in fact, a small part of the work, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done by the community, starting with putting the effort to understand what really happened and to look at our findings and to look at our recommendations, agree, disagree, question, critique, do everything that a healthy, critical community would do, but get engaged.
My greatest hope is that the west side of Greensboro and the east side of Greensboro would come together and at least talk like we had to do as commissioners, because that's what happened at that table. Different parts of this city came together. We had struggles, but we still respect each other.
That's the lesson, I think, to draw from this. It's not just about 7 people who struggled through over a 2-year period. We are a part of a process that involves a lot of people. And that is what it's going to take to be able to try to make real the recommendations that we're putting forward in this report.
I believe we've learned a lot from the past. And I'm hopeful that we can change the future for the better.
No one is ever going to be able to heal every wound, nor will any commission anywhere be able to bring complete reconciliation. But every step toward healing and every step toward reconciliation makes each community and the nation as a whole that much stronger and that much better. I'm very proud of what we've accomplished, and I'm thankful that a lot of communities around the U.S. are looking at us for leadership as a model to follow.
So, again, those of you that are just joining us, we were watching 2 videos on truth and reconciliation processes and methods in order to maybe begin to have larger conversations in our community about ways in which we can address our own racial injustice, the lack of equality, and move towards more healthy relationships with one another. And ultimately, the vision of these, a lot of it is a spiritual sense of forgiveness and reconciliation, making right relationships. And of course, we've learned from all of these processes that there's not that doesn't fix everything. That there, in many ways, these are structures that we need to integrate into civil society that are ongoing structures. And so I think that's what these conversations with LouLab are about. What are these ongoing platforms, processes, ways of being together that can give us the tools we need as a culture to engage these deeper issues of broken relationships, injustice, and equity building. I do want to take a moment to pause and see if there are any other comments from watching those 2 videos, specifically from those that have been on Facebook Live. If you would like to make a comment, or anybody want to unmute themselves and share what's coming up for you. Again, kind of harvesting our intelligence here is really important, so we can make connections to those. Anybody want to unmute themselves and join in the conversation? If not, I do have a little more ideas on, so I'll go back and share my Prezi, some ideas on ways and things that we're learning and some models of doing this. Hold on one second. It's the wrong screen. So I've been, as I've been sharing, hold on one second. I've got some other slides that reflect on truth and reconciliation processes. And some conversation points for us going forward. Hold on one second here. I'm having a little, here we go. One of the things that, as I've combed and looked through these different models of truth and reconciliation, and also done some research on effectiveness, and what does even effectiveness mean in these, related to these models, there seem to be three areas that I think are really important. And the first that we began talking about is this truth-telling process. And so some of the conversation that I'm wondering about that we might start having as a community is, what would be methods and platforms of truth-telling that would allow us to uncover our historical and current realities about discrimination, injustice, inequality, in both the personal spheres, the organizational spheres, cultural sphere, and also structural domains. It feels like the conversations need to include all of those elements where we've experienced injustice and racial discrimination. I would also think that a truth-telling process needs to include a curriculum for helping celebrate the contribution of Black communities to our culture. That's a voice that has not only been repressed, it hasn't been celebrated. And so I would think a curriculum that our educational system looks at it, and a cultural curriculum that celebrates the gifts and contributions of Black and Brown communities would need to be a part of that. But also what we're learning, a curriculum for white people to wake up to their power and privilege. Often what we talk about is what's called aversive racism, which is not overt racism. So it's white liberal people that hold equitable values, but they're not aware of the ways in which they propagate white power and privilege. It's an unconscious way in which they participate in it and propagate it for their own benefit. And so I think there needs to be a cultural curriculum, not only in schools, but in churches and organizations that we can all agree on, that help white people understand the ways in which they continue to propagate that, often unconsciously, but how we can take responsibility for that. So I would think any truth and telling process that gets created would need to include that kind of a cultural curriculum for Black and Brown communities to talk about and share their injustice, but also for white communities to do the work that white people need to do in this conversation. There are some things that are coming up, examples of that. I also want to make note, one of the things I found in the educational research is that some communities, some Latin American communities and even African communities don't believe in what we would call talk therapy, or re-talking about the event. In the West, we've really talked about, you need to share or relive the story by talking about it. And I think we need to be really sensitive that some cultures don't want to talk about it, but they would find more appropriate ways in which for that story to get expressed. And sometimes those may be spiritual practice, those may be other forms of telling it, but not necessarily verbally retelling the experience. In fact, some communities believe that's actually a way of re-traumatizing people. So I think in these telling, we would need to be very sensitive to how people want to do that, and then create a multiple models of truth-telling that honor the ones that have been victimized. So I did want to make note of that. There was some research about different ways in which communities do that, and truth and reconciliation needs to honor different ways people do that. There is a project coming up this fall called the Reckoning Project that Dan Getteman is doing, and it's going to be a really powerful project. I think is a good example of truth-telling. There's also another way of getting at unconscious dynamics of oppression, and it's called systems constellation work. It's taken from Family Constellations by Bert Hellinger, and it's a way, originally a way of revealing family dynamics where there has been an injustice or hurt or that love doesn't flow. But the same can be done in organizations and even in cities at looking at setting up a constellation where unconscious dynamics get arise in our awareness and get played out in it's kind of like a drama that happens. But I think that is a powerful tool that we need to integrate into our own process. And then again, there are a variety of ways that we can do this truth-telling process. The Big Table on Sunday nights is doing conversations on race, which is another opportunity for people to talk about the ways in which they've been felt discriminated in their story. And so that happens every Sunday night at 7. The next part that I'm really interested in that to me feels really important is actually how would we create in this process, what we've heard, and I've done some work with Lean Into Louisville, which was a Metro government program a couple of years ago that we started. One of the things that I heard from that is that people are tired of having conversations because we know what the issues are. And so by just asking people to keep telling us what the problems are is another form of traumatizing them or showing that we're not listening. The other thing is that they're saying the equity numbers, the qualitative and quantitative numbers that show that we're hearing them and doing something about the inequality are not changing. In fact, in many ways, they're continuing to distance between white people and people of color. So I would think any process we would put forward would want to look at how we actually address the systemic issues and measure that. Before we can really ask for right relationship, there has to be justice and there has to be equality. And so we need to agree upon some measures by which we're showing that inequality is changing in Louisville. Otherwise, we have no right to ask for right relationship if it shows that we're not actually addressing the underlying economic causes. And so a model that I'm interested in exploring is a thing called a Constellation Model for organizing. And this is a model that some of us have been kind of playing around with, but I think this would be a great model to talk about how we could allow for self-organizing groups of individuals and organizations to come together and focus on areas of their own passion while keeping them connected to other groups. So my idea is that we ought to start with maybe 5 or 6 constellations. And these are action constellations. They're not having more conversation. They're actually, how do you take good ideas and move them into collaborative action? And I think we ought to do an economic one. I think we ought to do an education one, a housing one, a criminal justice one, and I would put reparations in the economic conversation. And then the 5th one was, what did I have in here? I'm sorry, I had it written somewhere. The 5th constellation would be education, health, housing, the justice system, economic, and representation. So I think those are some of the major interlocking social issues that we ought to have constellations. And the idea behind constellations, again, I'm not going to go into this a lot, but I would think we would need to have a system in place in order to honor what people are saying are the issues, a way of moving people into action, because that's often what we hear is that they stop with conversation and we don't have a good system to move people into action in areas where they have passion. So anyway, I'm interested in the Constellation Model as a way of doing self-organizing and encouraging people to take action in areas where they have interest. The final piece in any of these process is what we would call reconciliation. And so the final piece is, how do we actually create spaces for forgiveness? How do we create spaces for right relationship? How do we create spaces where we can mend what is broken? And here I really think there's a spiritual religious element to that our religious communities need to really think about. What are these spaces when all of these other things are in process? I do think Louisville, this is my feeling about Louisville. I feel like people want right relationship. I feel like they want to mend and heal. And what I keep hearing is that the truth hasn't all been told enough. And equity, we have to be moving towards equity so that people know they're heard. And when those things, I have this kind of sense, when those things kind of happen, that collectively we may get to a place where then we can talk about right relationships with each other. But I think it's premature, or what we're hearing is it's premature to ask for that. It's premature to ask for peace because we don't have equity and we don't have justice. And so I think any process would definitely want to keep that as a goal, but would be very intentional about not asking for that, collectively asking for that until other things change and that people feel like we're in a different place because we've heard and we've responded as a community to make things right. So I'm done with my little presentation there. And anybody that I would love to hear some thoughts and comments from those of you that are on. Just what do you think about some of that? Let's, you have other ideas. Let's have some conversation. So feel free to unmute yourself and let's have some dialogue. Those of you that are joining us on Facebook, you're welcome to add something in the chat as well. Anybody want to join in the conversation? I'd be interested in what's coming up for you all. Feel free to unmute yourself. Britt, thanks again for joining in.
I wanted to say I really like your concept of the Constellation Model, where there's a wide and broad base of people working on the areas of injustice or the areas of inequity that they feel most passionate about, and maybe perhaps that their expertise is in as well. What do you think is the role of the city government in playing a role in that? And what's the relationship between the city government and then civic leaders? You know, I noticed the success of the models in South Africa and in Greensboro really were that in South Africa, Desmond Tutu is such a loved civic leader that people really were willing to kind of get on board because of his influence. And in Greensboro, the city council and the city leaders really were on board with it. What do you think about the role of city leaders and civic leaders here in Louisville? Do you think they would be open to it?
Yes, and yet I don't think they can. So I was asked to help create the Lean Into Louisville project, which was designed to raise our collective awareness to the historical and current discrimination against marginalized populations. But the challenge was that was created through the mayor's office. And I don't think it had trust. And there was no way of critiquing or holding accountable, responsible for the way in which city leaders and city government as a system has continued to perpetuate it. So there was a lack of an ability. So I think they definitely need to be invited in. I think one of the questions I'm interested in is, does Louisville's truth and reconciliation process need to have a judicial court system? Is that a mechanism that needs to have subpoena power, or that needs to have, you know, and if we do talk about a trial around injustices, how do we understand that to be, and you know, they talk about amnesty and how important that was in that experience. Those are really interesting questions for me that I don't really know. Like, would it be really important, or could we do a kind of a civic cultural process that wouldn't necessarily, I mean, would definitely have to look at the judicial system. I think that's what we're seeing, is that's one of our number one areas. But does it need to move to having judges, and is it a trial process, or is it a different kind of process that we might engage? So those are all great questions. My hunch is it needs to have a broad perspective, and it definitely has to be led by the people of color in the Black community. I mean, this is not a model in any way. Of course, that would be actually against what we're talking about. So it would have to honor what they need and want as well, but it would have to be owned by the whole community, I think. And I think some kind of model and process that would get the buy-in of Metro Council, so that it would have some weight to what it's doing and what it's going to ask and what it's creating, while not being controlled by that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other thoughts? Andrew, you have a thought or comment?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. I'm trying to narrow it down. There's a people's assembly process that has been used around the world and is similar in a lot of ways to the Constellation model that you just laid out. It's very much bottom up, fully participatory, and might be a neat tool for us to use even to get to the point where we're forming or deciding on a truth and reconciliation process. Because if we're thinking about this actually having some teeth to it, then it's going to need the full backing of the population of Louisville, or some substantial percentage of that. And if it's not fully participatory from the beginning, you're not going to get that. Thus, you're not going to get the people power that will demand accountability, that will demand actually implementing, and so on. So I wonder, if you have looked at the people's assembly process and whether that could be the first stage in, getting to the point where you could launch something like this.
Yeah, there's all kinds of ways of moving ideas forward, that would invite, democratic processes, ways of centering marginalized communities, voices of color, in helping create a process. So I think anything that would, moving forward would have to move out. Again, what these are for are not trying to say, hey, this is the way it ought to be done, as much as saying, what are conceptual models and frameworks we might want to engage in the conversation. It's hard for some of those processes to create it from scratch with that many people. So you have to have some ideas or thoughts or concepts to bring into the conversation where democratic process can work. But it definitely has to come through that in order to be claimed and owned by the community.
Yeah,
and
just
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. I think, there's got to be that channeling of energy and interest, and usually the people's assembly processes are done around a particular topic area, an issue that people care about, so that, folks that want affordable housing, gather around that particular piece of it, and maybe that fits into some of these 5 different constellations you laid out.
And Andrew, I'd be really interested. I know that you've been a part of some of those in larger issues, and so would love to have your continued thoughts. And Sally, did you have some thoughts? Thanks for being on.
Sorry, I had to step away and then come back.
That's okay.
I was wondering, so I missed part of what Andrew said, but I was wondering where you would get who would participate in the different areas, the different constellations. I mean, I'm a beginner in all this and just beginning to learn and try to find it, where I fit in and where, I can participate, and just learning about the whole process. So just wondering where you would get the people for each one of your the constellations that you mentioned.
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. A lot of times I don't, and I didn't explain the Constellation Model all that well. The idea behind the Constellation Model is that you would have, you would host these public forums where everybody gets to come together, and they can be around a question like, how does Louisville create a more equitable city where everyone can thrive, or something like that. Everybody who comes into the conversation then is led into a conversation process, and then good ideas surface from that. And then you allow the good ideas, the people that have them, to move into a constellation. And for constellations to work, you would have usually a co-host of a constellation, and there are people that already have expertise in those areas. So they would then host a constellation. So for example, if you thought, okay, the way I really want to address inequity is through education. I'm a teacher and that's my area of passion and expertise. Then we would have a whole constellation that would begin hosting other conversations just on education and equity. And then you create processes where good ideas surface, and people who have energy to do that connect with one another through some innovative processes of kind of project idea initiation. But the beauty of that is they stay connected to other organizations, so that you would also have partnering organizations like JCPS would also be a partnering organization for that constellation. So you would ask organizations that are already involved in that work to be a part of that constellation to help people know, oh, well, this is already going on. You might want to connect to that, because we don't necessarily want to reproduce good work that's happening. So Sally, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, please.
You would gather these. You would have maybe like town meetings in different parts of the community, and from there would be ideas that are moved to the appropriate constellation, and that's how they would be formed. Exactly.
Yeah, you would host conversations all over the place that would have a similar kind of methodology to rise individuals with good ideas and intention, and then you would connect them to a larger system. So there would be, like, one of the platforms would be these ongoing conversations across our city that involve different people. But then there's a mechanism to harvest the energy and insights in individuals back into a larger connectional whole. So the idea here is that a city has everything it needs. It just needs to be more connected to itself. So that's a basic principle of organizing. Yeah. Sally, how did you originally get interested in the conversation? Did you just see it online?
You mean this particular?
Yes, this particular.
Okay. Yeah, I saw it just, on Facebook where events, that are coming up, and so yeah, just trying to, like I said, find out, figure out where I am, where I fit in, what
right.
what I can do. Obviously, it's a big topic right now, big thing, and I think there needs to be change, and just trying to figure out where we as civilian citizens can plug in.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sally.
Learn more about the issue also.
Yeah. Yeah, and that would be one of the roles of constellations, is to have educational opportunities as well around those different issues. That's great, Sally. And what we're finding really happening all over the city is that people are, and I don't know how you identify, but especially white people that realize they have not been in these conversations before are going to have to engage, and they're trying to find ways to do that feel appropriate to their gifts, feel appropriate to their passions. And so you're a wonderful example of that, Sally. Thanks for being on the call.
Thank you.
Are there any other comments? We did have a couple comments on Facebook Live. I want to thank you all for again staying tuned. LouLab is an opportunity to begin to share in a larger community forums these kinds of ways of moving forward that we would experiment with LouLab. And so I think we're Interfaith Paths to Peace is deeply interested specifically in how spiritual and religious leaders and individuals engage these issues collectively out of our different spiritual traditions, because I definitely think Desmond Tutu is an example that religious and spiritual, there's a soulful element to this conversation that I think needs to be brought into it, and that I think we as spiritual religious leaders of all different faiths and types and have a real opportunity to bring to bear our resources and our traditions onto this conversation. And maybe without that being in some way led by, or at least heavily participated in by, our spiritual leaders and communities, I don't think it would have the same impact as if we really jump in together. So that's why Interfaith Paths to Peace is engaging in these conversations. So I want to thank you all for being on. Those of you that have joined us on Facebook and your comments, deeply appreciative. And again, every Thursday at 3 o'clock, LouLab will explore these ideas. And so I hope you'll come back and join us for more of that. And those of you that joined on Facebook, hope let's continue in the conversations, because now we talk about, we used to say the world changes one conversation, one gathering at a time, and now we say it's one Zoom call at a time. Do we transform the world? So thank you all for being on and appreciate your participation. Peace. Have a good afternoon.